When working in the kitchen, one of the best ways to ensure success is proper measuring. In just a moment, we'll begin to go over measuring dry ingredients. When measuring dry ingredients, you need to make sure that you have the proper tools in your kitchen. The tools we need to properly measure dry ingredients are fairly simple. We need dry measuring cups. You see two styles here, one made of metal, one made of plastic. What I'd like to know about both is that they are even at the top. There's no spout. You don't see measurements inside of the cups, because when measuring dry ingredients, you always want to be able to level off the measurement at the top of the cup to make sure that it's accurate. And for that purpose, I have a straight edge spatula that I'll refer to as a spatula from here on out. It has a nice straight edge that's not sharp. Some butter knives in some sets could also be used for that, but the key is you want to make sure that whatever you're scraping the top off with does not have any curve. And then also for measuring smaller amounts of dry ingredients, I have custard cups, which are the little glass dishes that you see, and measuring spoons. Typically, your dry measuring cups come in sets of 4, a 1 cup, a half cup, a third cup, and a quarter cup. And typically, your measuring spoons also come in a set of 4, 1 tablespoon, 1 teaspoon, a half teaspoon, and a quarter teaspoon. You can see the set that we have here has a 5th spoon, and that one is an 1/8 of a teaspoon. Most of the time that's not available in a set unless you're going to pay a little bit more. So when we get to measuring small amounts of dry ingredients, I will show you a way to measure an 1/8 of a teaspoon without having one of those more expensive sets. When you look at a recipe and you get ready to measure, you also want to think about that ingredient and how it relates to the food that you're making. Especially with getting so many recipes off of the internet, mistakes can happen when things are being uploaded, and you want to make sure that it makes sense that that ingredient is in that amount within the recipe that you see. So typically, things that go in measuring cups, or those larger amounts that need to be in dry measuring cups, are things like flour, granulated sugar, brown sugar, confectioner's sugar. You don't really see things like herbs and spices in cup amounts in most recipes, unless you're making it for an extremely large crowd of people. Also, when you see a recipe, if you see something like baking soda or baking powder listed as a cup amount, you should question that and look into it a little bit further before going forward. Flour and powdered sugar are measured largely the same. Occasionally you will see in a recipe that it should be sifted before being measured, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in the video. But right now I'm going to measure flour. And another thing that's really important, when your ingredients have been sitting around a while, they tend to pack down. So we're going to stir or aerate this flour a little before we measure it. Notice that I have this little scoop. And so when you measure flour, it's really important that you spoon or move that flour into the measuring cup and then heap it so it overflows the top or heaps over the top, and then level it off with that straight edge utensil. Now the reason this is so important is because flour is very small particles, and so it can pack down easily. If I were to take my measuring cup and dip it into my container, and even if I were to still remember to level it off, I would have a lot more flour in here than the half cup that I need. This is a half cup measure. So this one is a 1 cup measure, and I want to show you, when you measure it properly, how much room there is for additional flour if you were to pack it in instead of measure it properly by spooning it in and leveling it off. So if I take this precisely measured cup of flour and I tap it, This is also the reason that we use a straight edge to level off our cup, and we do not shake or tap the cup to level it off. So as I tap on this, you can see very little has fallen into the bowl, but air has been created. An air pocket has been created where more flour would fit in. So if you look in here, you can see all this space where more flour would have gotten into our recipe. And that might not seem like a lot, but if you have to put 2 or 3 cups of flour into a recipe and you do that 2 or 3 times, you've added more than a 1/4 cup of additional flour to your recipe. And that can make a huge change and really dry things out. So again, when you're measuring flour or powdered sugar, you always stir first to add air back in. Keep it so it's over the top, so it overflows the cup. And then with a straight edge, like a spatula, level it off. And then you'll have exactly the amount of flour that you need to be 1 cup in your recipe. Now we have the easiest ingredient to measure with a dry measuring cup. So this is granulated sugar, or table sugar, white sugar, you'll hear it referred to in some recipes. And this one is so simple because this you can, because the grains are bigger and denser and they don't pack down as much, you can just simply scoop it up, heap it over, level it off, and then your granulated sugar is finished. It's ready to go into your mixing bowl and add to your recipe. Brown sugar is probably one of the most unusual ingredients to measure. It is actually supposed to be packed down into the cup. So unlike flour, where you had to gently spoon it in to make sure that you did not pack it down, brown sugar, not only can you scoop it up like granulated sugar, but you need to pack it down. I like to use the back of a spoon. Sometimes I'll pack it starting inside the bag. It's really important when you're packing this that you're not holding the handle of the cup when you pack. Otherwise, you're likely to end up breaking the handle off. So if you're holding it, you want to hold the cup in your hand and press. And again, we still do this until it heaps over the top. Better if I hold it over my brown sugar bag so that it heaps over the top of the cup. And then we level it off with the spatula just like before. And then to check and make sure that you measured it properly before you put it in your recipe, you want to make sure that you dump it out into a custard cup. And if it holds the shape of the measuring cup, then you've measured your brown sugar properly. So remember, brown sugar is the only one that gets packed. And anytime you see it listed in a recipe, it should be packed unless otherwise stated. One measurement that in my teaching I've seen a lot of students get confused by is a 3/4 cup of a dry ingredient. The liquid measurements aren't as difficult because the liquid measuring cups usually have marked 3/4 of a cup. But most standard dry sets come with a 1 cup, a 1/2 cup, a 1/3 cup, and a 1/4 cup. And so without there being an exact 3/4 cup, some people, or some of my students in the past at least, have gotten kind of stuck on how they should measure 3/4 of a cup. So really there are 2 ways that you can measure 3/4 of a cup with dry measuring cups with this set. One way is to simply take that 1/4 cup measuring cup and 3 times, 1, 2, 3 times 3/4 cup or 3/4 cups went into the mixing bowl. So that's 3/4 of a cup. Now the other one You have to remember your fractions and your equivalents. So the other way to measure it is to do the half cup once and the quarter cup once, because a half cup is 2 quarter cups. So if we do a half and a quarter, when we add those together, we get 3 quarters. So you do the quarter cup once, and we do the half cup once. And again, we have 3/4 or 3/4 of a cup. Now we'll move on to measuring small amounts of ingredients and dry ingredients. And when we measure small amounts of dry ingredients, that tells us that we need our measuring spoons. So I have a variety of ingredients here that we're going to measure. We're going to start with the salt. I've poured this into a separate storage cup to make it easier to measure. And salt basically measures a lot like we did with our measuring cups. We just like the granulated sugar, we scoop it up, heap it over, and then level it off. And then it's ready to add to whatever recipe we're going to put it in. And so the straight edge spatula can be really important again. Now some ingredients, like this baking powder, come with a straight edge already as a part of the measurement, just like this garlic powder does. You can see it has a straight edge over here. So when I measure my baking powder, I need a teaspoon of baking powder. I don't need the spatula because I can simply scoop it up so it heaps over. As I bring the spoon out of the baking powder container, I can make sure that that edge is cleaned off so it's a precise teaspoon of baking powder. Now, one of the things I've seen people encounter in measuring spices out of some of these boxes is they'll, it gets really difficult. They think that their spoon doesn't fit. So I can't measure my spoon, can't use my spoon to measure this. Well, the truth is, you just have to make sure that the curve of your spoon matches the curve of the container. And then same way with the baking powder. So that you clean off that edge and have an exact measurement of your garlic powder. Now, some dry ingredients are a little bit messier to work with because they're bulky. And so I have 2 of those here, and I have Italian seasoning. So if I try to measure Italian seasoning, I want a half teaspoon of Italian seasoning. And then I try to measure it with my, clean off the edge with my straight edge spatula. Then I notice I knocked a whole bunch of the herb out of the measuring cup. You can see lots of empty space in the measuring spoon. So I don't want to do that. So with things like leafy herbs, they don't really pack because of their shape. So that I am going to do more of a shake to get a consistent a measurement. You'll find the same things with something bulky like sprinkles. I wanted a tablespoon of sprinkles. If I used my straight edge spatula, I'd end up knocking out more sprinkles and I'd have a lot of space in the cup or in the bowl of the measuring spoon. So I don't want to do that. So I'm just going to shake those loosely, lightly, and get the right amount into my recipe. I mentioned earlier that there's a way to measure 1/8 of a teaspoon with your measuring spoons, even with a less expensive set that doesn't have a measuring spoon that size. So to demonstrate this for you, I'm going to use cinnamon, and I'm going to measure 1/4 of a teaspoon because that would, and level it off. That would be the next closest size to the 1/8 of a teaspoon that we're going for. And that would be, 1/8 of a teaspoon would be half of a 1/4 teaspoon. So you measure it off, measure it accurately, the 1/4 teaspoon, and then use a scraper or a knife to make a line and push half of that ingredient out of the spoon. And what you're left with is 1/8 of a teaspoon. So that's just one way you can measure it easily if you don't have the more expensive set that has the 1/8 of a teaspoon. Additionally, 2 pinches equal, and it can be 1/8 of a teaspoon. You just take your thumb and forefinger, pinch the ingredient twice, and that can get you about 1/8 of a teaspoon as well. So another issue I'd like to address while we're talking about measuring dry ingredients is when you get a verb listed in the measurement for the ingredient. For example, if I had a recipe that called for nuts and it wanted them to be chopped nuts, so they were nice small pieces in the recipe, if the recipe says 1 cup nuts chopped versus 1 cup of chopped nuts, that tells me what state the nuts should be in when I measure them. So for example, if it was 1 cup of nuts, chopped, I would want to measure them whole and then chop them up. These walnuts are not going to take up as much, they're not going to get as many walnuts in the cup when they're in their whole form. So you're going to have a little bit less in the recipe. And so the same goes for if they're supposed to be chopped before they're measured. These smaller pieces of nuts are going to pack down more into the measuring cup. And so you're going to get more in 1/2 cup of this size than you would in 1/2 cup of this size. And so that's really important to remember. And that goes back to what I was talking about with sifted. Sometimes a recipe wants you to sift powdered sugar or flour before you measure it so that you add some extra air to that ingredient and get a little bit less in the recipe. Sometimes it wants you to sift it afterwards just so that any lumps that may have been in the ingredient are eliminated to make the rest of the recipe easier to put together. Measuring your dry ingredients properly is one of the most important ways to get your recipe off to a good start in the kitchen. That's true whether you're cooking or whether you're baking, but to be honest, it's even more important for baking, because cooking, you might have the opportunity to see that something's gone wrong and make adjustments, but baking is very much about precision, and by the time you figure out that there's a problem, it'll be too late to fix it. The best you'd be able to do is start over, and sometimes time doesn't allow for that to happen. So in order to get yourself off to a good start on your next project in the kitchen, whatever recipe you choose, follow these techniques for measuring your dry ingredients, and you'll put yourself on the road to success.